did just want to ground us before we get started in an important relationship for Park people, which is with TD Bank. And TD Bank has been our founding sponsor. They've been with us from the very start. They were our first funder. And we wouldn't, as an organization, have gotten off the ground with TD now 10 years ago when they first supported us. And this support was really instrumental as we established ourselves first in Toronto. And the leadership support from TD was hugely instrumental in Park people making the decision to actually to expand our work across Canada and have capacity to do that. Today, with TD's support through the TD Ready commitment, Park People's national network is 1,000 community park groups strong. And I think a bunch of folks are here, so that's awesome. And it's made up of, as I mentioned before, grassroots community groups, nonprofit organizations, and municipal staff across the country. With TD's longstanding support, Park People helps these groups that we just spoke about make awesome things happen in city parks. And if you are one of these groups, tell us a little bit about those awesome things. And in 2022, the network will band together at the just announced National Park People Conference slated for 23 days. So you don't have to squeeze it into 3 anymore, 2 or 3 anymore. We'll have 23 days of Park People community awesomeness. And TD, again, is a founding sponsor for the event. And so, I think we'll talk a little bit about this today, probably a lot about this today, but, I think city parks have come into our consciousness in a bit of a different way over the last few years. And we're so grateful for TD's foresight and leadership in helping us, really grow the Canadian parks movement. So without further ado, I would like to pass it to our partner in doing this work, Carolyn Scotchmer, to say a few words.
Thanks, Zara. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I won't take too much time. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm really excited about the panel. And I know that people are not necessarily here to listen to me. So just to start off, though, I do want to just mention that I am coming to this webinar from the Treaty 13 lands as well. As Zara mentioned, the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Wendat, and an area which is now home to a diversity of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Like Zara, I feel like personally, the traditional lands and talking and integrating and learning about the Indigenous ways of caring for the land and of viewing relationship with the land are particularly important in this conversation, especially as it relates to how we've built our cities and how we use our green spaces. For an increasing number of Canadians that live in our urban areas, of course, city parks are our primary, and for some of us, even our only real access to natural and open spaces. So, and when I say increasing number, it really is increasing. Some of our core cities have dropped a little bit over the course of the pandemic, but for the most part, people are just moving into other urban areas. So overall, the percentage of Canadians living in cities continues to rise. Full confession, I thought I could come in here and wow with some updated 2021 stats. The census results are due to be released in like 19 days, so a little bit of ahead of our time here on this, but the most up-to-date numbers indicate that number is increasing and it will continue to grow over the next few years. And what that means is that our green spaces and open spaces are more important than ever, and I think that's become increasingly clear over the last 18 months. What has also become increasingly clear over the last 18 months is that while these spaces are the backbone of our cities and critical for our physical and mental health, building community, building personal resilience, that not everybody has access to these spaces in the same way. And not everybody's needs are accommodated within these spaces, which is why I think this conversation today is so very important. The other reason that I'm really excited to be here today is just a chance to acknowledge some of the great work that Park People has done over the last decade. And I know that Park People don't do it alone, and that there are so many people on this conversation who are important in every way for the work that they've done in their local community. But over those last 10 years, I've actually been in TD for most of them. Well, it's hard to believe, but I've seen firsthand how the parks conversation has changed. Before I arrived at TD, I was actually in the sector working on the nonprofit side, and parks and green spaces have been critical forever, it feels like, but for a very, very long time, to the communities that live in them and use those spaces. And on that front, nothing's changed. The work was done, for decades. It continues to be done. But I feel like what has really shifted over the last 10 years or so is that networking piece. We now come together in a way that we weren't before to share our stories. A park project in BC can share its learnings with a park project in Halifax and rethink the way that maybe we're approaching some of these things. We can also pool resources and leverage additional resources by acting as a larger community, which gives us ultimately greater influence on how our parks are planned and how we work with our many municipal partners right across the country. And I feel privileged to work for an organization that understands this. I mean, TD has been working in this space for a very long time, and we understand the importance of engaging everybody in the community in our urban green spaces as participants, stewards, and as park champions. And we also understand that those words and those roles look very, very different for different people across the country and in different demographics. So, which is all to say that the work that Park People does and the work that so many people listening in on this conversation do is so critical to us building healthy communities. And I'm really excited to listen to today's panelists and think about how those resources and perspectives can push us even further ahead in this conversation. And I will turn it back over to you, Zara.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. And I was just taking a moment as you were speaking to meet everyone in the chat. It's nice to see all of you. Welcome. And can I invite our panelists to join me here, and we can get our conversation started. So you will find everyone's beautiful, impressive, incredible bios on our website. So we're not going to take the space to read all those bios, but please feel free to peruse them as we're going through the webinar to just really meet their brilliant expertise and lived experience that we're going to talk about today. So I'll just do a quick introduction. We'll get started. We have Carolyn Crawley from Misanokama. We have Cheko Denibo, founding director of ancestral services at Future Ancestors Services. And we have Ambika Tanetti, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. And so just a couple things before we get started about how we'll flow in our time today. So we're just going to give each of the panelists 5 minutes to talk about their work and how they're connected to this conversation that we're going to have today. And then we're going to move through a questions and conversation. I mean, I'm hoping that we just riff like with all good panels. So to the panelists, please feel free to jump in and hot pursuit anything that's particularly intriguing or thought-provoking that your peers share. But what we'd love to do is, in the spirit of change, hope, and tension, the title of this webinar, we're going to move through sort of 3 thematic areas to look at sort of the past, how we got here, what's happening in the present around movement building in parks and green spaces, and then just looking forward, what is the call for all of us in this work? So with that, I'm going to pass it first to Carolyn to start us off.
Okay. I'm Gretch. Ani Bojo, Gwe, Scano, Tanse, Wache. Good afternoon, everyone. Maybe it's, I guess it's the afternoon, maybe late morning for those who are on the West Coast. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. And I also want to just say thank you for that invitation to come and share with you all. So I just want to share a little bit about who I am and what I do. My ancestry, I'm Mi'kmaq, Black and Irish. And I'm originally from the East Coast, in Magi territory, but Takaranto has been my home since a young child. And I currently operate my own business called Misanokama, which translates to all my relations in Mi'kmaq. And really what that means is from Indigenous perspectives, from coast to coast to coast, we have that phrase in our languages, all my relations. And it's really looking at all of the beings as our family, as our loved ones. And I don't want to get too much into that because I know I only have a bit of time, but I'll try to explain that throughout the talk when I'm sharing today. So the work that I'm doing is I'm passionate about supporting people to reconnect with the earth, as there's no separation between us. From many Indigenous peoples, as I mentioned, that they are our relations to be treated with as much love and respect and reciprocity as we do our human relatives. And so it's important that everybody knows that all of our ancestors at one time and place were in a deeper, more meaningful relationship that was culturally unique and specific to where they were located. And we can still see today that many cultures around the world are still in that practice, in that relationship. So my work is really about creating opportunities for people to return home to that relationship. You know, we're in a critical time, as we know, and for me, it's really important to create that opportunity for people to connect with the earth in maybe a different way. And so the work that I do are in the local parks, mostly in the city parks and ravines, but there are times that I've done them in provincial parks. And so what I always share is that the earth, you know, was our first teacher and also our first healer and our first grocery store. And there's a lot of, as Indigenous peoples, we knew that if we were to step out of that relationship, or like, and because we've been forcibly severed from that relationship in many ways throughout history, and maybe we'll get into to talk about that in a bit, but we've always known that when, you know, to be healthy, we need to be in that balance with the relationship. And so when people spend time out on the land in that relationship, you know, it can reduce the feelings of anxiety and depression and PTSD. It can actually increase our our NK cells, which is a type of white blood cell that actually supports our immune system, because all the plants and the trees emit a chemical called phytoncides. And so, you know, the work that I do is really not just about what can we get from the parks, you know, the parks. And I say the parks because even the word park feels like a separation just in that language. So when I think of the parks, I'm thinking about the land, the earth, right? And all those relatives, all the interdependence connections that are there. And so it's not, for me, like when I'm sharing the work, it's not about what we can get from the parks or from the earth, but also what can we give back? Because it's important to be in a healthy reciprocal relationship. So how do we find that way of going back to that? And we can see that, you know, oftentimes we'll hear about, and I know people in my life who are land defenders and water walkers and protectors, right? Who are standing up for the waters and the lands and the beings, right? And also thinking of those 7 generations ahead. So the work that I do too is all about decolonizing current interactions with the earth or with the parks, because when we think about it, the parks or these lands have been greatly harmed by the impacts of colonization. And so when we're talking about reconciliation, reconciliation also has to happen between, you know, with the parks or with the land as well. And so I share a lot of Indigenous ways of knowing from elders and mentors and that are been in my life, sharing knowledge about foods and medicines, whether they're growing from the plants or the trees or the mushrooms, or sharing knowledge about the language of the birds and tracking as practices that these are Indigenous ways of knowing that were vital to know about, and still vital to know what's happening on the land. And then also sharing the work that I do in the Indigenous Land Stewardship Circle that's based here in Toronto, that's building relationship in what's known today as High Park. And so that circle encompasses elders, knowledge carriers, earth workers, academics, and it's a collaboration between you know, many of us who are from different nations and settlers and newcomers. And so the work that we're doing is really about fulfilling our sacred and treaty responsibilities to care for the land and to be in that reciprocal relationship that considers the future generations of all the plants, of all the animals, of all the beings, the waters, and so forth. And so when I think about some of the tensions in the work that I've been doing, it's often that if I am harvesting, because I'm exercising treaty rights, in that relationship, if I'm harvesting, and I'm always harvesting in that good way, because I'm thinking about all the beings, it's not about just me. And if I'm harvesting, there's oftentimes so I have people telling me what I can and cannot do in the park. Also times there's challenges that we've had in expressing as through the Indigenous Land Stewardship Circle, when we've had meetings with city staff who don't understand our valued way of knowing. And it's often prioritizing Western science over Indigenous knowledges, which also within Indigenous knowledges is science, because we had sciences amongst all of our nations. And then also too, part of that work, when we think about the tensions, is just, just recently, a few years ago, there used to be, there hasn't been prescribed burns in High Park for a couple of years now because of COVID. But prior to that, these prescribed burns were happening with no acknowledgement of it being a practice used by Indigenous peoples from all across the lands here in Turtle Island. And there was reasons for those control of prescribed burns, whether it was to increase or support a black oak savanna for food, whether it was to prevent forest fires from spreading or in the future, whether it was to support certain plants and to come up, whether it's to use for materials that we needed. So that's a little bit about my work. I hope I didn't go past 5 minutes. Miigwech. Walalio.
Oh, thank you so much, Carolyn. And I'll pass the mic over in a second. I just want to flag, you said something that, you said so much that resonated. And there's one thing I was reading recently where, it was an article that was talking about how we all went out into green spaces in a different way over the last 2 years. And it was a real source of renewal and support for our mental health and all of that. And the article was talking a little bit about how, we went in and pulled the energy from nature to heal ourselves. And we didn't think about that rebalance and that reciprocity, which is, nature needs some stuff too. Nature needs some love too. And it's been really all about how parks can help us, how green spaces can help us. And I really appreciate you bringing into the conversation the attention and the responsibility and the recklessness, to be honest, if we don't work in that space of reciprocity and heal back, right? Give some of that energy back. So on that, Ambika, can I pass the mic to you to share a little bit about your work?
Sure. Hi. Thank you, Park people, Zara, for having me here on this conversation. I came here as an immigrant to Toronto in 2012, and I joined the university. When I was working in India, the last work that I was doing in India was with rural and indigenous communities, trying to understand their relationship with their forests. I used to find that really missing, the connection to the land and to the nature in urban areas. People are concerned in India about the land that they own, the gardens and the houses or the farms, but I didn't see that concern for trees in the city when they were being cut for development. So that was something missing. And when I came here, I had a friend in the faculty who was working on resident associations and their engagement with the urban forest. And I was like, wow, this is great. If neighborhoods can get together and influence policy, that is something that does that really happen? I'd never heard the term urban forest before. So I was like, if I'm an immigrant, I've just arrived here, I'd never heard this term before. I'm coming from a different country where my cultural, politics, social, everything is very different from what is here in Canada. So how are recent immigrants like me connecting to the urban forest? So that's how I started my work. And once I went to the field, I realized immigrants don't connect to the urban forest as such. They connect to urban nature and urban green space. That's what they understand. That's what they can engage with more. So there, the focus shifts from trees, which is more of a technical understanding of an urban forest, to everything in nature that is there, which includes, if you know, immigrant communities connect a lot with urban agriculture. community gardens. There's like long waiting lists for them. COVID has had some change, made some change. Earlier, you wouldn't hear of too many immigrants going into, like, that was something I was hearing constantly during my fieldwork, was we see a lot of immigrants in the parks, or immigrants as people of color, which again is a term that we can try to sift out and understand what that means. We are also settlers. So a lot of immigrants are found in parks, people of colors are picnicking, socializing, but you rarely find them in the ravines or in the trails. And that was also interesting to like try to figure out why are they not going into the ravines. And that's when I started walking with park people community groups, lots of them, to understand what's happening. Why are they taking people out into the ravines, or why were they not going into the ravines earlier? So that has been how I came here. And then the last thing that I did was the race and nature study for Nature Canada with Jacqueline Scott. So that also was like totally made me also understand a different perspective of what's really happening on the ground. I'll pass on to you. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ambika. And as I'm listening to both of you, and no doubt Chuck as well, and I pass the mic to him in a minute, you're setting so much context around how we arrive at this conversation, and even just that, really intersectional lens around, in India, these, what we would call parks are typically more private, right? Like they're typically, and I think you even said in a previous conversation we had, you have to pay to get into them, right? So, coming here and seeing how we treat the conditions of, these shared green spaces is so different. So thank you for bringing that in. Chuck, over to you.
Hello, bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. Je m'appelle Chuck Odenibo. My name is Chuck Odenibo. Yeah, this is a good conversation. So I guess I'll start off by saying, as I grew older, so essentially when I was very young, I used to love being in green spaces. My favorite thing to do in a green space would be to read a book. It would be to, when technology got sufficiently good, download the TV show, watch it on a device on the outdoors, sort of like listen to my iPod while sitting underneath a tree, like very relaxed activities. And so as I grew sort of older, I started to sort of feel like nature wasn't for me. Nature isn't really a thing for Black people. It's just not really a thing, right? And I kind of came to that realization via, the faces of the people that we see in outdoor spaces, the faces of the people that we associate with environmentalism and as being environmentalists, the kind of activities we associate with outdoor spaces. And it's taken a while, but essentially sort of understanding how the various components of my identity have influenced the ways in which I see, understand, and interact with nature and with the environment. And so it wasn't until university when I took a more intellectual interest in the environment and took a couple of environmental courses that I then had a professor. And I remember this distinctly. It was a third-year sustainability course. And for our final exam, the professor was like, for your final exam, you've got two options. Either A, you can do something to change the world in the next 2 weeks and submit proof of that to me, and I will mark that. Or you can do a literature review of papers. And I was like, what could I do? And so I checked municipal bylaws in the city of Kingston. I was going to Queens at the time. So I checked municipal bylaws in the city of Kingston and had a photo shoot with some friends where we were naked in an outdoor space with computers and books and all these things. And titled sort of that entire composition, My Green Dream, the idea of reintegrating with nature while still being very much human. And I submitted that to the United Nations because that year was the year the UN was having their Rio +20 conference on sustainable development. And the United Nations published it on their website. So you had world leaders just casually seeing me naked. Anyway, submitted that to my professor, who was also shook at that seeing me naked. But what was really interesting was sort of this aftermath of people really identifying with a different environmental message, and me sort of realizing that, wait, I'm not the only one who approaches nature differently. I'm not the only one who has a different relationship with the environment, but still wants to protect it. And so that is what sort of really pushed me into environmental and into sort of green spaces. And as I sort of worked in green spaces, there were lots of limitations that came from various components of my identity. So I used to work as an environmental scientist in the oil and gas industry in Alberta. And I used to have to go, when we were going to rural areas, I used to have to go with my white boss, who would then knock on people's doors, because a lot of well sites are on people's private land and private farmland. So you'd have to like knock on people's doors and be like, hey, just to let you know, the person's going to be like evaluating the land is Black. Just so you're aware, don't shoot him, please. Which made me feel guilty, because I was the only one who had to have my boss accompany me, whereas all the other stuff workers at this organization were able to sort of go out and be independent. So I felt almost guilty, right? And then you have sort of that experience coupled with experiences where I was in Haida Gwaii, talking to a team member in French, and the person, someone who was not at all related to the conversation, comes up to me and is like, "You're in Canada, speak English." And I'm like, we're in Canada, that's precisely why I speak French. What is happening right now? And so all of these sort of experiences kept on happening to me as I'm trying to do environmental work. And it sort of really clicked to me that it's not just sufficient to fight for the environment. I have to fight for environmental justice. I have to fight for justice in green spaces, and justice when we talk about environmental movements and climate movements. I don't get a choice, right? There's often a lot of very prominent environmentalists have often said things like climate change is the largest threat that we have to deal with, or X, Y, Z. Or whenever I talk to people in parks, it's really sort of, we need to really sort of conserve the land and protect nature and all these things. And that is the most important thing for our future generations. And while that's all very true, it ignores the fact that it's incredibly difficult for racialized people and people of other marginalizations as well, but especially racialized people, to participate in these processes and to really sort of get out there and advocate for the environment, when we're also having to deal with all of these barriers that come from components of our identity that we have no control over. And so that is how I started my two organizations, the Poison the Apple and Future Ancestors Services. So the Poison the Apple, I started with Samantha Matters, who is this phenomenal, fantastic Métis woman. And the goal of the organization is to really sort of rebrand nature, right? In the most multicultural country in the world, we branded nature as really just being for white men. And that shows in the demographics of people who do visit parks and who do go out onto those trails that Ambika was talking about, and who try and access those trails and whatnot. And so it's sort of trying to rebrand nature as being for everyone, rebrand what it is we see as an activity in nature, rebrand what it means to be an environmentalist, so that everyone can look for ways in which they can connect with nature at a personal level. And in forming that personal connection, look for ways to fight for the environment. And then on the other hand, we also have Future Ancestors Services that I founded with Larissa Crawford and Samantha Matters. Again, two phenomenal Métis women. And you know, our organization seeks to really sort of act in a way that is dignified of people who are calling themselves the ancestors to the future generation. So it's like, how can we reconstruct our society, reconstruct our systems, and reconstruct our world in such a way that when the next generation is born, they're born into a world where they're able to fully blossom without the difficulties and the barriers that we have faced. And so all of that sort of leads to me being these sort of multiplicity of spaces where I'm in the space of nature and health, because that's really important, in spaces of environmental and climate justice, and really sort of also looking at ways in which language and linguistic justice impacts my understanding of nature, looking at ways in which being Black has both hindered and helped the ways in which I connect with nature, and how we can sort of undo intergenerational trauma that hinders people from being able to go into outdoor spaces. So in recognition that I only have 5 minutes, I'm gonna sort of stop talking now, but yeah, that's kind of how I've entered into these spaces. A love of nature, but also a realization that there are barriers that are limiting my ability to truly connect to the land and love the land. Thank you.
Beautiful, Chuck. And thank you so much to all of you. And I just, Chuck, I think one of the things we have to center in this conversation is that we are past the era where we talk about protecting the land exclusively without thinking about the people and the intersectional realities of the people, and how those might compound and create barriers for folks trying to access green spaces. I think you've also affirmed always choose the change the world option when given lit review or change the world, with all the love to our academic friends. But that's pretty amazing. Carolyn, can we invite you back into the space? I don't see you quite there. You are beautiful. So you all did such a great job of covering the past. So I might actually move us to the moment, and I'm gonna to the present and sort of split it into two parts. Right now, and Carolyn, you talked about this too, just around being out and harvesting and using parks, and they're still being sort of the rules, right? What we can and cannot do in these spaces, and all of you touched on this. So I'd love to know, where do you feel we are right now? Because there's been so much rhetoric and there's been so much writing and there's been so much talk and webinars and conversations, but where are we now in the context of, and my dog is making her appearance as expected. Welcome all creatures. But where are we now in terms of access to green space for Black, Indigenous, racialized folks? How do you feel the present moment is sort of opening or still, keeping those barriers in place?
Yeah, I think, just listening to what has already been shared and how that's resonating, I think there's still so many barriers when we're talking about access. And also too, when I think about many of the parks are the people that are in positions of power are people who are white settlers. And there is, and I'm talking from an urban setting here, and there's kind of almost like an exclusion of Indigenous relationships, that are authentic and because in the work that I'm doing in the land stewardship circle, we've had conversations about the amount of glyphosates that are being used in Hyde Park, for example. And, we're concerned not only for the well-being of all those of the beings there, but how does it impact the people, right? Because as I said earlier, there's no separation between us and the earth. We're all interconnected. And whatever's happening to the earth is impacting us and vice versa. And so I think, what we've been saying is, if we want to exercise treaty rights and be able to harvest some medicines, and we're always going to do that in a good way, always thinking about all the beings, we can't do that safely when these places are being impacted by herbicides. And what are the impacts of that? And so I know in the city doesn't even have record of how much glyphosates have been used over 20 years in Hyde Park. And to me, I just don't see that kind of working. And so I know a lot of people that I work with in community that avoid going to the parks because they don't know when when it's going to be sprayed with those pesticides. So I also think too, like when we're thinking about the history, because I think it's really important for people to understand what the history is of the creation of parks, which were intentionally to displace Indigenous people and to starve them, because to displace them from their traditional hunting, fishing, grounds, from harvesting. When I think about the West Coast with the creation of Banff Park back in like 1887, I think it was under a different name, maybe Rocky Mountain National Park or something like that. And so when we're looking at the history of parks, it's really important when we're thinking about the present, that we look at where we've been, where we're coming from, and where we're going. And so I'm also kind of thinking too that, today Parks Canada is building, relationship with Indigenous communities, mostly in northern areas, but we don't really see that heavily happening as much in southern parks, with municipalities and Indigenous people. So there's still kind of this exclusion that is happening. And there's also with parks too, it's almost like they're created as like a museum. And so it's like, it is really like something that's separated from us. Stay on the path or the trail, don't touch, don't harvest, that sort of thing. And so it's really lacking relationship, which is very different from Indigenous ways of knowing, because all the lands, there was caretaking involved. It wasn't about leaving the land and having it pristine and untouched. There was relationship there. So it's like, how do we find a way to ensure that these parks, these places that are called parks, are welcoming for Indigenous community members? We try to have, our sacred fires, and there's times when, someone will call the fire department and, and tell us to put out the fire. Some things are starting to shift, and I can see that probably in the past year or so, there's been a bit more movement on the City of Toronto to have an understanding of what's happening with collaboration of Indigenous peoples all across the city, whether it's in Taylor Creek or, the Humber or High Park and so forth. But there's still a long way to go. And so really just kind of looking at who are the faces that are in the park, as was mentioned before, who are the people that are, in these positions of power, making these decisions. And if they're not reflecting the diversity of Toronto, how is that going to be welcoming to go into those places? Oftentimes when I go into the park, these parks are usually, these, green spaces are usually located in very kind of middle to upper class neighborhoods. You can see there's more green spaces in those areas, So when I go into High Park, I don't see that diversity of people. And especially I don't see that diversity amongst the staff that are working in the park as well. So I think those are kind of like the things that I'm thinking about when I'm, in regards to the park today. So yeah, miigwech.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Carolyn. And I might ask our panelists if it's okay with you to all unmute yourselves while we're together, because it's nice to hear the mm-hms and the laughs and the energy. So if you're comfortable, I'd love that. Carolyn, really quickly, I think that these places called parks, right, even just continuing to name that is so important. And just thinking of it just made me think about how, we're constantly looking for cues for how to behave in shared spaces. And if you're not seeing those activities, right, those rituals, those practices, it often takes a lot of courage even just to use these public spaces, these seemingly public spaces, let alone when you see no evidence of the thing you most need to do there happening. So thanks for that. Chuck, can I pass it to you next?
Absolutely. So I think this is really interesting because when we talk about the present, as Carolyn mentioned, it's incredibly important to sort of obviously consider and conceptualize the past and how the past has impacted the present. And so when I think about parks and I think about where parks are currently, it is a lot of things that come to mind. And so I'm going to be struggling and structuring myself, but I'm going to do my best. And, please feel free to call me out if you're like, I don't understand where this tangent is coming from. But when I think about parks in the present, the first thing I think about is how parks in the past used to be used as a tool of punishment and oppression for Black people. I think for other people of color as well, but I'm very sort of well informed in Black history, right? And so a couple of weeks ago, me and my team members were actually in Halifax for the first time, and we went to Africville. And so for those of you on the call who are not aware, Africville used to be a Black community. It used to be a thriving Black community, and then they were sort of demolished, and a park is currently in its place. And the park is beautiful. It is a stunningly beautiful park. But I felt physically ill in that park after learning the history of what happened in that park, and the fact that the park, this beautiful, stunning park, was used as a way to displace Black people and move them from self-sufficiency into what is currently largely a state of poverty. And we saw that as well with Horgan's Alley in British Columbia. We've seen how in the past, Black people who were promised land for fighting in World War II were given the land that was known to be, infertile, right? And so we see deserted communities in Alberta that used to be thriving Black communities, but they were not able to grow anything on that land. And so they slowly sort of migrated to urban centers. And I think about sort of the ways in which that influences our understanding of nature today. Black people, for example, are the most highly urbanized population in Canada. 94% of Black people live in an urban area. And a large chunk of this is that that lack of ability to connect as a result of intergenerational trauma, where nature was used as a tool of harm. And so if nature is used as a tool of harm, now Black people in today's generation have the burden of trying to re-establish a different relationship with nature in hopes that they're able to sort of stop that trauma from being passed on to the next generation of Black people, whether those Black people are coming in from immigration, those Black people are born here. So there's sort of that piece I'm thinking of. The other piece I'm thinking of is the lack of inter-BIPOC conversations that that take place, right? So often as people of color, as Indigenous people, as Black people, we have a habit of really sort of talking to the people who hold power, which are currently white people, especially white men. But we also kind of forget that we also sort of fall a little bit differently on the societal power scale. And there are times where we could benefit from having conversations between one another, between our different communities, and creating sort of shared understandings and shared partnerships. I remember I was talking to Nathan Obed, who's the president of ITK, which is the representation of Inuit people at federal level to the federal government. And so ITK sort of really represents Inuit Nunangat, which is the areas where Inuit people live. And part of Inuit Nunangat is Nunavut, the territory. And so I asked Nathan, I was like, what's ITK's role in immigration, right? Because Nunavut has a very sizable population of Black people from Nigeria, sizable population of Filipino people, sizable population of Indians. So, you know, what is ITK's role in helping immigrants connect to this new land, and also make sure that they're sort of connecting with Inuit culture, because that's the land that you're entering into. And he was like, "Oh, Inuit people are very welcoming." I'm like, that's not a policy, right? That's a lack of conversation. That's a perpetuation of a problem that's happening. We talk about lack of multilingual conversations, right? We always say we're a bilingual country, but conversations often have a tendency of happening only in English. And then we sit down and we sort of question, and then there's that question of, you know, we need to be able to better recognize Indigenous languages. And so if we are unable to even have conversations in two languages, how are we supposed to have conversations in a plethora of languages at the same time? Which is, you know, what our ancestors used to do, right? In the past, people created creoles and pidgins because their languages would meet, and then you'd use a couple words from the other person's language, they use a couple words from your language, and find some sort of common understanding. Right now, English is almost a tool of constant recolonization, because it's not only colonized our present, but since we're using English to talk about the future, it's also colonized our future. So we're limited and restricted to an English understanding of the world. And kind of as Carolyn mentioned, the word park on its own in English creates that distance, right? Whereas I'm currently learning Michif with my Métis colleagues. And yesterday we learned about the word for this. And they were like, there's two different words for this. One word for this refers to whether something has a soul or not. And one word for this is for things that have a soul. And one word for this is for things without a soul. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting, because that changes your perspective on the land that we're talking about, right? I'm gonna stop talking because I think I've been talking for a while. But essentially, when I think about the present, those are what I'm thinking about: lack of inter-BIPOC conversations, lack of multilingual conversations, and also there's a lot of tokenism that happens a lot of times in these spaces, right? There was this almost after the George Floyd thing, this rush. We need to get a BIPOC person to speak, and so what we're seeing is a lot of BIPOC faces with white voices telling them what to say, which is equally as harmful, if not more so, right? So those are some of my thoughts.
Chuck, I don't even know where to start. There are too many threads. I think there's so much to respond to there. I think your last comment is a really important one. And for those, you know, who are allies in our chat, to really think about getting specific about what sharing power means, releasing, and even just releasing from control, right? And part of this is the surrender of, you know, what we're gripping onto. And I think that's really important. And the piece around language, right? Sometimes we just can't communicate because the words we have in different languages, they say something different that no collection of words in the English language can. So I appreciate that so much, and so much of what you said, what you were all saying. Ambika, over to you.
Do I need to say anything after what Carolyn and Chuck have said? Except maybe, yes, talking about immigrants or people who are new arrivals to this land. Like the label of immigrant kind of makes us feel we are not responsible for anything. But I just want this message to go out to all immigrants, new immigrants, people who are coming in now, that you have come to this land, which is the land of the indigenous people, and at the invitation of the colonial government that is here. So you are a colonizer, you are a settler, and you need to realize that. And you need to remember that you have a responsibility towards this land, because the indigenous thinking of 7 generations, thinking for 7 generations ahead. If you've decided to make this your home, then learning from what Robin Wall Kimmerer has said, that if you want to become a native to this land, you need to think about your children on this land. That is one thing. And the other thing I just wanted to talk about was thinking of nature as a neutral space. Like, we are welcoming, we're not telling anybody they can't be here. Like, nature is open. Nature is not the problem. It's the people who have created those spaces or who are in those spaces that's the problem. And that was one of my findings. What people said, like, often the myth is that one is immigrant people are not interested in environmental issues, and they don't go into parks and ravines because they feel there are bears here. No, we do know that there are no bears in Toronto. We do know that. Maybe we're just trying to throw you off because you asked us that question. But it's the people, the look that we heard about. It took me some time to understand what the look was, because I feel I am not one of those ethnic minorities who you can look at and say, oh, she is from India. I could be from Latin America, from Spain, from Portugal. Like, that's what I've heard from people. So I'm not a threat to anybody. So we brown people don't like to talk about race. That's another problem we have. So how do we have those conversations that Chuck just mentioned? If you're going to talk about land and you don't want to talk about indigenous people's experience or Black people's experience, and you try to think of nature as a neutral space, it's going to be really difficult. And we need to go back to our histories to understand why it is what it is, and what are the advantages that I think a lot of immigrant communities have over the indigenous and Black communities already living here for a long time. Because we do come with, while we may have a cultural baggage and racial baggage, we do come with higher educational qualifications, a lot of them. So they are able to climb up faster, like up the social ladder faster than a lot of other people. We don't have that historical burden on us. So we don't think of what's happened in the past, and we can just like, okay, we are here to make economic gains. We're here to settle. This is what we're going to do. So just wanted to think about those 2 aspects of immigrants when we're talking about Black, indigenous, and people of color on this land.
Ambika, thank you so much. I wanted to point out a couple things. When you talk about bears in this space, it's also talking about the right of all creatures to share the space with us, right? It's like they're taking over our space. Like, well, is it really our space? Was it ever our space? So I think that's one piece. And then the really important thing that you flagged is this goes back to Chuck's comment about inter-BIPOC conversations, because I think there's a problematic assumption that across these communities, there's a unified voice. And we've seen that there's a lot of lateral violence, right? Community to community fighting for space. And we want to be considered. And I think for us to get to a place of solidarity, and specifically to focus on our indigenous friends and our friends from the Black community across this country, to say, what do you need, and be in solidarity. I think that even that is a conversation that is so complex and tough on its own, separate from talking to our the white friends and allies. So I appreciate you flagging that. We are down to the wire. So there's so much more. There's days of richness and wisdom in this group. What I might ask, and this is, is just a really quick 30 seconds from each of you, which is the worst. So just say whatever you want to say, and I will give you each 30 seconds. Just let's look ahead. Let's look into sort of tomorrow and the days after, and where are you feeling hope, and where can we keep pushing as a collective, as the 224 people on this call, as a collective invested in what each of you are talking about. Where can they push? Where can they actually start to tomorrow move forward some of the things we've talked about today? And Chuck, you're nodding, so I'm going to go to you first, but 30 seconds to a minute.
Dear Jesus. Okay. Doing my best. So I always love ending on a feature note, so I'm actually really happy that we're able to end on a feature note. I will say, I think moving forward, and I think moving forward, one of the things we really need to do, and I think this touches upon Carolyn's point, is nature needs to stop being a museum space. Right? When we enter into spaces of conservation, it's the idea that, we're freezing nature in an arbitrary moment in time. We can't touch it. It needs to stay away from us. And that creates a lot of harmful rhetoric, because we're not seeing ourselves as part of the environment. And if we don't see ourselves as part of the environment, why are we fighting to save it? Seriously, why am I fighting to save a park that I can never enter into? So you sort of got that piece of, we need to stop seeing nature as incredibly static and start understanding that there's a multiplicity of nature and a multiplicity of ways of being in nature, and to stop seeing everything as nature's enemy. Because I think there's also a lot of false dichotomies that have been created throughout time, where we sort of see homeless people as nature's enemy, or we'll see technology as nature people's enemy, and all these different things. And so to sort of try and end this, there's this one meme that I think went around for a while and still goes around once in a while, where it's if trees produced Wi-Fi, we'd stop cutting down trees. So why don't we just have Wi-Fi on trees? I don't understand why that's unimaginable. That would be amazing. I would love Wi-Fi on trees. So really sort of being open to a multiplicity of futures and recognizing that nature is not static. We should not try and make nature static, because in doing so, we're doing nothing but harming the environment and also harming ourselves in turn.
Beautiful. Thanks, Chuck. And Ambika, I'm going to go to you next.
So I think it's about building relationships with the land and with the people across all cultures is what stands in hope for me. Unfortunately, in Toronto, we have very few stewardship sites where people can build those relationships, but we need to get people more aware of where they are, what is happening there, and have more representation in those sites. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambika. And we will end as we began, Carolyn, with your voice.
Wallen. Yeah, Ambika said it's relationships. Relationships are the foundation of everything. Relationships with ourselves, with each other, relationship with the earth, because there's no separation. We're all interconnected in that way. And really kind of looking at, starting from ourselves, how do we deconstruct some of that conditioning? How do we shift the language of how we speak about the land, all those beings? How do we work in collaboration? I know there's bringing Indigenous and Black and people of color communities together to share our culture, right? There's so much there that we can share and learn from each other, to connect on the land, to be doing ceremonies on the land, in that way, not only for us, but for the earth. I think it's so important, because we have to be thinking about those generations that are yet to be born, and not the generations of people, but the generations of all beings. So
thank you so much, Carolyn. Thank you to all of you. This is I wish we could throw up emojis in a webinar, but my screen would just be covered in gratitude and hearts. I would, as I'm wrapping up, ask everyone in the chat to just share some love. It can be a word, it can be some gratitude, it can be where your mind and heart is at right now. But if everyone could just take a moment and put a word in the chat to just so that our panelists can feel your energy. And for those of you who are keen to learn more, you can check out Park People's website, parkpeople.ca. There is our awesome 23-day conference coming up in 2022, which we hope to see you all at, see all of our panelists and all of you at. And it'll be our 3rd national conference. And I think to the points made, it's about building connections and relationships. Finally, we have the pup made the appearance, but really to come together to build those relationships so that we can collectively start to think about the future of these green spaces and how we work together in reciprocity with them. So subscribe to our newsletter to stay informed and stay updated on all the latest conversations and awesome activities, and keep in touch. And I think there'll be a short survey being sent around, so let us know how this was and how you enjoyed this webinar, and have a beautiful rest of your week and weekend. And we hope to see all of you very soon. Thanks so much for joining us.
Au revoir tout le monde.
Mama P, take care, everyone. Wishing you good health.
Thank you.
For mine.